Welcome to my author's talk. My name is Jaymie Feldman. I was born and raised in Toronto, Ontario. I live in North York, specifically at Bathurst and Wilson. My mother Jill is a naturopathic doctor, and my father David is a chiropractor. I have two little brothers who I love so much. My brother Jonah loves Family Guy, Bob's Burgers, and basically nothing else. My littlest brother Hayden, on the other hand, loves to read and write almost as much as I do, and his love for writing and how I see him look up to me has been something that has pushed me to be very creative. My childhood might be what one would call very sheltered. I grew up living in a very Jewish neighborhood where everyone would play in each other's backyards and keep their doors unlocked. I loved everything about it though, from the friends I made to the games I would play. When I was a baby, books were my favorite thing in the world. I refused to go to bed without my parents reading to me, and they would put books under my pillow for me to read when I woke up in the morning. From the time I learned to turn a page on my own, I was reading, or just looking at the pictures. When it came time for JK, I was already reading small chapter books, and it was basically all that I did. My friends and I would sit together through recesses, and instead of talking, we would read. Some of my favorites then were the Magic Treehouse series and Junie B. Jones. My first exposure to writing came from watching my mom write in her journal all the time. She always said she was writing stories for me to read when I got older. Since I wasn't allowed to read those ones, my parents would help me write my own books. I would choose a topic, like animals, and then I would write a book about it. They were never very creative, and they were mostly pictures, but I loved every second of working on them. As I got older, I started to get obsessed with fantasy and fiction stories. My all-time favorites were Harry Potter and the Twilight Saga. I was the biggest fangirl in the world, and I was even voted most likely to become a vampire in my grade 6 yearbook. My love for creative writing started around grade 6 as well. For a book report I did on Breaking Dawn Part 2, I wrote a short story sequel for it about Bella and Edward's daughter, Renesmee. Back then, I was so proud of the story, but looking back, I have no clue what I was thinking. With lines like, "Her parents loved her more than anything, would do anything to keep her alive. There was one other person who would do anything for her, and that was her bodyguard / best friend named Jacob. There was something special about Jacob. He was a werewolf. He had pledged his life to Renesmee and lets her out of his sight." I definitely had a long way to go. In middle school, my love for writing kind of stopped because I had a terrible English teacher. She didn't help inspire me, and it was hard to love what she was teaching us. In my own time, I tried so many times to write in a journal. I never stuck to one journal for very long, either getting bored of it or finding one with a prettier cover. I now have half a dozen half-full notebooks or journals, and many of them have their pages ripped out. Around grade 9 and 10, I was in the height of being a fangirl for many YouTubers, boy bands, and book characters. I obsessively read fan fiction, and I even tried to write some myself. They were all basically really cringy and about me marrying assorted famous boys. In grade 10, for my IES project, I really wanted to improve my creative writing and make something that I was proud of. So I took my idea from my grade 6 book report and I went with it. I wrote 3 short stories that all served as sequels for some of my favorite books. I included a redone version of my Twilight sequel, and I also did Harry Potter. This project changed the way that I see writing because I had finally produced works that I was proud of and that I wanted other people to hear. My love of fiction and fantasy worlds has not just had an effect on what I write about, but also on the television and movies that I watch. I'm always happiest if you put me in front of a TV with anything regarding vampires on it. The place that I get my biggest inspiration from is my camp. I've been going there for 9 years and it is my second home. I've become the person who I am today because of the people that I met, experiences that I've had there, and that I continue to have. When I'm at camp, I get tons of ideas for stories, and I have so many lists of topics to write about. My magnum opus that I'll be reading later on takes place at a sleepover camp that I've loosely based off of my experiences at my camp. I've never really been one for the classics, so the authors that inspire me are mostly young adult fiction authors. Of course, J.K. Rowling was the author to introduce me to the world of fiction that I love to this day, so she's up there as someone who inspires my writing. Another author who I'm obsessed with is Jennifer L. Armentrout. She writes fiction sci-fi books about different kinds of creatures and worlds that I love to get lost in. I've read every single one of her books, and I think that my writing style has really begun to reflect hers. The last author who I have just recently learned about from this class, in fact, is Raymond Carver. Miss Siegel gave me the idea to write one of my short stories using his style of writing because of how different it was from mine. My sentences tend to run on, whereas his are short and choppy. I put a lot of detail and description in my writing that takes up a lot of space, and Carver is very brief with his descriptions. He also writes a lot about dirty realism, whereas my stories are generally with characters that I can relate to and end in happily ever after. The short story that I wrote then was called Room 113. It was about a heroin addict who hallucinates and sees her life before her as she ODs and eventually dies. The quotation from the end of the story goes like this. "The little girl, she's right there. Don't you see her? Why can't you see her? I try to sit up. I can't move. I try to open my eyes. I see a dirty motel room. I see Cal. The girl is gone. I see nothing. Goodbye, G, I whisper as I fall asleep. Sweet dreams." This quotation was very representative of how my writing had changed from learning about Raymond Carver. Last but not least, my forever favorite, Stephanie Meyer, was the one to really bring me all the way into the stories that I love. She introduced me to one of my favorite topics ever, vampires. I will never forget those books and how much they've affected me, despite all the hate that they get. Another one of my biggest inspirations for my writing are my friends. They are the people who I spend most of my time with, and they make me so happy. Whenever I'm in a slump or a writer's block, they always support me with ideas and laughs that cheer me up again. Also, just listening to the things that they say can often be the push that I need to get inspired to write. As I mentioned earlier, my style of writing consists of very, very, very long sentences and lots of description. In one word, I would call it verbose, and so have many of my teachers and peers. I often go into too much detail and then talk about things that have no meaning and don't need to be there. One of the things I've been working towards the most is trying to have shorter sentences and to get my message across without so many words. Another huge critique of my writing is my lack of rhetoric in most things that I write. Before this year, I never really knew what it was, and now that I've learned, my next steps are to actually include it in my writing. I'm so happy that I was switched into this class in October, because I have learned so much here that I don't know that I would have learned anywhere else. I've seen the changes in my writing throughout the year, from my ability to write better dialogue to being comfortable putting my emotions to paper. I've learned to reach out of my comfort zone and be able to be proud of what I've produced.
Stop.